The story of Judge Boyd is one that stretches across to decades, beginning with a multi-million-dollar bond nightmare and ending in a courtroom drama filled with blame, shattered reputations, and broken trust. At the center of it all was a $2.7 million bond deal gone terribly wrong. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must go back to the beginning when a respected judge, a complicated financial arrangement, and a circle of trusted attorneys set the stage for 20 years of legal battles, suspicion, and ultimately collapse. The case began with what seemed to be a routine bond matter. Bonds are often part of financial agreements, bail arrangements, or investment packages where money and trust go hand in hand. In this case, a $2.7 million bond was placed under the supervision of Judge Boyd's court. For many, it appeared to be just another transaction, but beneath the surface, pressure was building. The people involved were powerful, attorneys with reputations to protect, clients who demanded answers, and a judge who was expected to oversee it all with fairness and wisdom. What followed, however, was far from fair. Allegations began to circulate that the handling of the bond had not been above board. Questions arose. Was the money truly accounted for? Had someone mishandled the funds? Was there manipulation behind the scenes? These questions haunted everyone involved, and in time, the $2.7 million bond became a symbol of broken systems and misplaced trust. For Judge Boyd, the nightmare would not end quickly. Instead, it dragged on for years. Lawyers pointed fingers at one another, clients demanded justice, and the judge's role became the subject of endless speculation. The once respected authority figure now faced criticism, not only for how the bond was managed, but also for the larger question: who was responsible for ensuring that justice was done? By the early 2000s, cracks had already begun to appear. Attorneys close to the case insisted that the responsibility lay with the judge. Others claimed that lawyers had failed in their duty, leaving the court with no clear path forward. Each side had something to lose: reputation, livelihood, or even freedom. And so the legal battles dragged on. Year after year, the case found its way back into the headlines. Each time, new details seemed to emerge. Some accused the attorneys of manipulating the situation for personal gain. Others argued that Judge Boyd should have acted sooner and with more authority. Meanwhile, the $2.7 million bond sat at the center like an immovable weight, reminding everyone that justice delayed was justice denied. The passage of time only deepened the wounds. Families of those affected watched their lives unravel as legal fees piled up. Reputations were destroyed, and once promising careers collapsed. For Judge Boyd, the years took a visible toll. The man who once commanded a courtroom with dignity was now the subject of whispers, his legacy in question. As the 20th year approached, it became clear that something had to give. The case could not drag on forever, and the courtroom was no place for endless circles of blame. Finally, after 2 decades, Judge Boyd made his fateful decision. He dropped the case. For some, it was a relief, a chance to finally move forward. For others, it felt like betrayal. After so many years, after so much pain, could justice really end with a dismissal? But the decision was not the end. It was the beginning of a new storm. By dropping the case, Judge Boyd opened the door to accusations that justice had not been served. Attorneys who had long deflected blame now found themselves under sharper scrutiny. Clients who had waited for answers were left with none, and the public, watching from the outside, was left to wonder whether the legal system had failed entirely. When Judge Boyd finally dismissed the Bond case after 2 exhausting decades, many believed the long nightmare had ended. But instead of closure, the decision ignited an even more bitter storm. Attorneys who had once stood shoulder to shoulder in the same courtroom quickly turned against one another. The bond, worth $2.7 million, had not only vanished into years of legal disputes, but had now destroyed reputations and shaken trust in the very institution meant to protect justice. For some, Judge Boyd's dismissal was a relief. It marked the end of endless hearings, motions, and legal fees. But for others, especially the families who had waited for justice, it felt like betrayal. How could decades of waiting end with no clear answers, no accountability, and no resolution? Their frustration echoed a larger truth. The case was never simply about money. It was about faith in the legal system, faith in authority, and the expectation that truth would eventually prevail. The attorneys, who had long been central to the case, quickly became the targets of blame. Some argued they had simply followed procedure, doing what any lawyer would have done when caught in a complex financial dispute. Others insisted their colleagues had failed them, concealing information, twisting facts, or placing their own reputations above their duty to the client and the court. In this environment of suspicion, trust between legal professionals collapsed. But deeper than any single lawyer's mistake was the exposure of structural weaknesses. Within the justice system itself, oversight had been poor, accountability mechanisms had failed, and the culture of delay had been allowed to grow unchecked. Instead of timely justice, there had been postponement after postponement, hearing after hearing, and an endless cycle of appeals and reviews. In the process, the truth slipped further and further from reach. The $2.7 million bond became not just a missing sum, but a symbol of systemic failure. Judge Boyd, once a figure of authority and respect, bore the heaviest weight. For 20 years, his name was tied to the Bond nightmare. Each return to court reminded him, and the public, of the unresolved dispute. His health and reputation deteriorated under the pressure. When he finally announced that the case was being dropped, it was not a moment of triumph, but one of exhaustion. He had grown older under the shadow of a case that refused to end, and in the eyes of many, his career became defined by it. The attorneys fared little better. Some faced formal disciplinary reviews, while others quietly stepped away from legal practice altogether. For those who remained, their reputations were forever clouded by the memory of the case. Some protested loudly that they had been scapegoated, unfairly blamed for failures that belonged to the system as a whole. Others admitted, at least privately, that mistakes had been made, mistakes born of pride, ambition, or fear of losing professional standing. But the most tragic victims were the families tied to the case. For them, the legal process was not a debate about accountability among professionals. It was a wound that never healed. They had spent years waiting for answers, enduring financial and emotional strain, believing each new hearing might finally deliver closure. Instead, they were left with silence. The case ended not with truth but with dismissal. To them, it felt as though decades of suffering had been erased with a single judicial stroke of the pen. The aftermath was felt far beyond one courtroom. Newspapers ran retrospectives on the 20-year bond nightmare, analyzing how a case involving such a significant sum could stretch on. Without resolution, legal scholars dissected the failures in articles and classrooms, pointing to the dangers of delay and the need for reform. They argued that justice must be transparent, timely, and accountable, or else risk losing legitimacy altogether. For students of law, the Boyd case became a cautionary tale, an example of how even experienced judges and respected attorneys could be trapped in cycles of delay, indecision, and blame. Perhaps the most haunting truth about the $2.7 million bond case is that it did not collapse in one dramatic moment. There was no sudden revelation, no shocking twist. Instead, it was a slow unraveling stretched across 20 years. At countless points along the way, individuals could have acted differently. A lawyer could have spoken out with greater courage. A judge could have insisted on swifter resolution. Oversight bodies could have intervened before the matter became so tangled. But none of these steps were taken, and so, year by year, the case sank deeper into a swamp of confusion and bitterness. For the public watching, the implications were sobering. If a bond worth millions of dollars could disappear into legal limbo for decades, what hope was there for ordinary citizens seeking justice in smaller, everyday disputes? If judges and attorneys could argue endlessly without resolution, what confidence could anyone have in the fairness of the system? The Bond case became a reminder that justice delayed is justice denied, and that time itself can be the greatest enemy in the courtroom. Judge Boyd's decision to finally drop the case may have spared the court more wasted years, but it also cemented his legacy in a way he could never escape. Instead of being remembered for decades of service, he became remembered for one case, the case that would not die. To some, he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, a man who inherited a mess and did his best to manage it. To others, he was the architect of his own downfall, too cautious, too unwilling to demand the accountability that might have resolved matters sooner. For the attorneys, the end of the case was not the end of consequences. Whispered accusations followed them wherever they went. Some were marked as careless, others as self-serving, and still others as cowards unwilling to take responsibility. In the competitive world of law, reputations once damaged are rarely repaired. A few tried to rebuild their careers, but many found the shadow of the case followed them long after the courtroom doors had closed. The families, however, could not move on so easily. For them, the case was not about law books or precedent, but about real life, about trust that had been betrayed, money that had been lost, and 20 years of waiting for nothing. Their bitterness ran deep. Many spoke of sleepless nights, of children growing up under financial strain, of opportunities lost because the Bond case hung over their lives like a curse. When Judge Boyd dropped the case, it was as if those 20 years had been erased, as if their pain had never mattered. In the months that followed, the story of the Bond nightmare continued to echo. It was discussed in law schools, debated in legal journals, and remembered by those who had lived through it. Some saw it as proof that the system was broken and needed reform. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about pride, delay, and the human flaws that creep into even the most formal institutions. And for many, it became a personal reminder of how fragile trust can be. In the end, the case was not just about a missing bond. It was about the erosion of confidence, the damage of delay, and the failure of responsibility. Judge Boyd's decision to drop the case after 20 years closed the file, but left open wounds. For the attorneys, it ended with blame. For the families, it ended with bitterness. For the public, it ended with a chilling lesson about the fragility of justice. 2 decades after it began, the $2.7 million bond nightmare remains one of the most haunting stories in modern legal history. It showed how a single case can consume lives, destroy reputations, and undermine faith in the system. And it serves as a reminder that justice must not only be fair, but must also be swift. For when time becomes the enemy, truth itself can disappear.